everyone. Thank you for joining our event for the introduction to the DEI Code event. We have a lot of exciting things prepared for you today, but before we start, I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Treaty 1 territory and that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. So again, welcome everyone to our event, and thank you for setting aside the time to join us today. So before anything else, I would like to introduce what CFA Society Winnipeg is doing and what is CFA Society Winnipeg. So CFA Society Winnipeg has served the Winnipeg investment community since 1952 by promoting ethical and professional standards within the investment industry. Our society is an active participant and innovator within our international organization, the CFA Institute. We are also a member of the newly formed CFA Societies Canada, which promotes advocacy efforts to our regulators. In addition, CFA Society Winnipeg provides our members with professional development and educational opportunities, job placement services, and membership networking events. So, as I've mentioned, we have an exciting hour coming up. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you all to our moderator for the panel, President of CFA Society Winnipeg, Emily Burt. Emily is currently the Executive Vice President and Chair of Cardinal Capital Management Incorporated. In addition to that, Emily is also currently a Director in CFA Societies Canada. If you have any questions during the event, please feel free to send them to Emily at any time during the presentation. So Emily.
Thanks, Erica. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you all with us this afternoon for this great discussion. I'm going to kick us off right away and introduce you quickly to our three panelists. Liz Oakland is here joining us from the CFA Institute. She's the Society Relations Manager responsible for all Canadian societies and for those societies across the Eastern US. Welcome, Liz. Joanne Hadamasha is Executive Director of CFA Montreal and has more than 25 years of experience in human resources. Welcome, Joanne. Sanjana Vijayan is the Manager for Diversity and Inclusion at the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce. And we're really pleased that you could be with us today, Sanjana. Thanks to each of you for bringing your valuable insight and experience on this topic to today's discussion. Liz, if we could start with you. You've been very involved in the rollout of the CFA Institute's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Code. If you could maybe give a bit of an introduction on what the DEI Code is for those joining us today that may not know much about it yet, I think that would be a great way to start diving into this topic. Thanks, Liz.
Yeah, thank you, Emily, and thanks to CFA Society Winnipeg for convening this event and inviting me to participate. I'm very excited to talk about CFA Institute's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Code, which launched in February of this year. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are all critical elements in the investment industry, and CFA Institute believes that they're essential to the future success of investment firms. Diverse perspectives improve investor outcomes, and an inclusive industry can better serve our diverse society and its investment needs, and an inclusive organizational culture makes for a better place to work. And to help ensure that these initiatives take root and flourish, CFA Institute worked with several partners and DEI experts and other people across the industry to develop its Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Code. The code itself is comprised of 6 different principles. I'll go through them quickly and give a high-level explanation of what each principle contains, but there's a lot more in-depth information about all of these principles available on CFA Institute's website. The first of the 6 principles is pipeline. This includes the creation and expansion of a diverse talent pipeline. This leads into talent acquisition, the second principle, which talks about the importance of establishing and maintaining inclusive hiring and onboarding processes. That leads into the third principle, promotion and retention. Organizations that sign on to the DEI Code are committed to designing, implementing, and managing inclusive and equitable promotion and retention practices to help reduce the barriers to progress. Leadership is the fourth principle, a commitment to amplify the voice and position of your leadership to promote and improve DEI outcomes. And this includes reporting on your firm's progress. Influence is the fifth principle. Use your organization's influence to promote and increase measurable DEI results within the industry. And the sixth principle is measurement. Measure and report progress to drive better results, including reporting on DEI outcomes to senior management, the governing board, and to CFA Institute. The DEI Code's objectives are to define the current state of DEI in the investment management industry. We've designed the code to kind of meet the industry where it is, and we believe that the code can be implemented by firms of any size across the investment industry more broadly. Another major objective is to outline key principles for firms to implement, and also to provide a metrics-based reporting framework so that we can measure progress and produce meaningful results. In addition to the code itself, there are two kind of supporting documents, the first of which is the implementation guidelines. These go through the 6 principles in great deal and provide a lot of different suggestions for ways that firms can work to improve their own progress or results in these individual spaces. The idea is not that firms would undertake all of these at once, but that you can look through here and pick a few different areas under each principle, or pick 2 or 3 of the principles to work on at any given time, and find lots of different suggestions for how you can improve DEI in that area. It really gives people a lot of flexibility to hone in on what's going to work best for their firm, given the current state of its DEI initiatives and the goals that are most important. CFA Institute's DEI Code currently has 40 signatories thus far, and we're really excited to continue to expand that number in the months to come. We set an initial target for the code's first year of 25 signatories, and this was based on the number of organizations we typically see sign on to other codes and standards that we've rolled out in the investment management industry. So we're thrilled to have already exceeded that number in just the first 3 months that the code has been publicly released. A few notable Canadian signatories include SLC Management, Fiera, and the First Nations Financial Management Board.
Thanks very much, Liz. Sanjana, you've been an advocate in this space for some time now, and while I know you're not directly related to the CFA Institute's code, could you share with us what you've seen organizations implement over the last few years? And as well, I know you've had a very successful event just recently with Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce. Could you share with us some insights from that event that might be useful to our audience?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I'm coming to this conversation from the perspective of the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce, and we run a diversity, equity, and inclusion program that supports our business members and our organizations and our membership to become more inclusive and equitable workplaces. We recently launched a program with a similar name and might get confusing, which is called CODE, and this stands for Commitment to Opportunity, Diversity, and Equity. And CODE really came together because a lot of businesses were responding to a large social call to action for workplaces to do more in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. But at the same time, businesses were seeing lowered financial and human capacity to take on new projects. So as the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce, our primary role is to support members and their priorities. And so we created CODE to support businesses and organizations to take on these initiatives and strategies more impactfully, and to not necessarily outsource and hire DEI consultants, which might be pretty expensive for small and medium-sized businesses. So we created a lot of programs to help build capacity within these organizations to do this work. So we have a online diversity, equity, and inclusion resource hub where you can find a number of different resources around these topics, learning opportunities, toolkits, and templates. We host a number of events that's free for members to attend, and some, like our conference, do hold a ticket cost. But we're bringing these conversations to the forefront and allowing for spaces for peer exchange and peer learning around these topics. We also launched a code coalition, very similar to the code with CFA Society, which calls on organizations to publicly commit to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in their workplace. And that we launched in March of this year. And since our launch, we have over 80 signatories from our membership sign on and publicly say that this is a commitment that they share and they are taking actions within their organization. They will submit reports about the actions that they take each year. And all of those reports will get aggregated into one final report that's available every October. And as we go on, we hope to mobilize the entire Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce membership to join us on this collective movement towards equity, inclusion, and reconciliation. One thing that I'll share in terms of your question, Emily, and what I've seen organizations try to implement over the last few years is a big piece is around learning. We're really seeing folks take on more learning opportunities, hire folks to come host workshops in their workplaces. And this is a really, really big part of doing impactful diversity, equity, and inclusion work. One thing that I'll talk about a little bit later on today is the first step is to be unafraid of taking a realistic look at your organization's practices and policies as it is. Only when you truly understand where you are and where you stand, are you able to identify where you might be upholding systemic barriers and what you can then do to remove those barriers and pursue equity. So that's a really important thing that a lot of folks are doing right now, and it's commendable.
Thank you so much, Sanjana. Joanne, if we could go over to you next. I believe your society recently became a signatory to the CFA Institute's code just when it launched in February, and that's Montreal Society, being the first Canadian society to become a signatory. I know CFA Winnipeg is just starting to dig into it, and as well, really as all societies are. Could you share with us what prompted your society to do it as quickly as you did, and what was the adoption process for your society?
Thank you for including me in this conversation. At CFA Montreal, the conversation about DEI had started way before the actual idea of the code came to be with CFA Institute. We have always, I would say, included diversity, especially gender diversity. That was more the focus of the conversation, making sure that we were pushing advancement of women in the finance industry forward and bringing a lot of women events to the forefront. So the conversation having begun earlier on, it was easy for me to onboard the directors as their own organizations were also partaking in those actions and conversations already. The process really required us to understand what signing on to the code actually meant for us as a society, as we do have 3,500 members. So we were weary of having to take stock of that information. But once we understood that that came to be of the CFA Institute resort and that we could concentrate on the reporting from a employer standpoint and volunteer standpoint, it made the task a lot more accessible to us, a lot more realistic in terms of the resources that it would require for us to uphold our commitment to that. So once all of that was set forth, the process in itself was really easy, as it is a simple form to sign on. But that's the easy part of the whole conversation. Now the real work begins, where we are now in the process of honoring our commitment and setting forth those practices and taking stock of our own inventory of in terms of documents, practices, and think leadership.
Thanks, Joanne, that's great. My next question I think I'll ask of each of you. Maybe we'll start with you, Liz. Are there any common concerns that you've heard of from organizations that are considering adopting a DEI code? And if so, how would you address those concerns?
Yeah, one common concern that comes up is that finding candidates from underrepresented populations means that organizations have to lower their criteria and look for alternative talent. You know, charter holders are seen as being at the top of their field, and I think there can be something sort of threatening about this idea that in order to diversify our team or our firm, we might have to hire someone who doesn't have that same level of experience or education. But I really think that this is a misperception, and the DEI Code's implementation guidelines provide several different metrics and strategies and suggestions that can help organizations source highly qualified candidates from populations that are underrepresented in the investment industry. It's also not only a matter of looking in the right place. Our inherited assumptions of what being highly qualified means are also challenged by some of the metrics suggested in the implementation guidelines. Better DEI practices in external recruitment include hiring for cultural add as well as cultural fit, and modifying recruitment practices to consider a wider range of education levels, degree types, and experiences. Organizations should also consider that there are more types of diversity to factor in other than gender and race. Sexual orientation, ethnicity, generation, socioeconomic status, citizenship status, non-native language speakers, religion, veteran status, neurodiversity, and the intersectionality of two or more of these categories. These are all diverse groups, even though they're not all ones which are given legal protection. So as your firm defines diversity and considers, more groups than just the ones that I think are given the most attention currently, I think firms learn not only about different ways they can add diverse talent to their workforce, but they may also find diversity that already existed within their employee population that they didn't know about.
Thanks, Liz. Sanjana, could you share with us any common concerns that you have heard and how you've addressed those?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we've heard is capacity, and that folks don't have the capacity to do this work right now. And our response from the Winnipeg Chamber is to keep up. Inclusion really is the pathway ahead. So we need to start creating capacity within organizations if you don't want to get left behind. But at the same time, through code and through a lot of different organizations, resources and diversity, equity, and inclusion tools and templates are becoming more and more available. So to make use of those opportunities and to the Winnipeg Chamber of Commerce, for example, has those free resources available online. We do have free workshops. Make use of those free opportunities and lean into this work right now, because it truly is the pathway ahead. Another thing that we hear is that a lot of folks are really afraid of saying the wrong thing. And to a lot of Liz's points, if we are actually doing the work within our organizations, if we are improving our recruitment practices, our leadership practices, our tools, practices, and procedures, we're walking the walk. And so if there is something that is that we say that's wrong, we can always apologize and wholeheartedly say that we are doing the work. And again, know that that's what people care about. When things are performative, that's when organizations tend to really face a lot of backlash from folks, primarily online. So there's a number of different things that organizations can do to protect themselves against a backlash. And the biggest thing is avoiding tokenism and avoiding performative action. So you can avoid tokenism by improving your talent pipeline. There's a number of different places that organizations can post their jobs that isn't just Indeed or LinkedIn, which will, again, welcome only a select few job seekers who are on these platforms, but diversifying where you're posting, whether it's reaching out to newcomers, serving agencies, community centers, Indigenous job boards. The Winnipeg Chamber has a newcomer employment hub. There's a number of different ways that you can reach diverse talent pools more effectively. Another piece is that once you do start receiving applications, ensuring that you're looking at your hiring process, whether you are only hosting your interviews through a panel that might not allow neurodivergent folks to bring their full selves to the interview. Instead, looking at different avenues where folks can showcase that they are in fact skilled for that position through work assessments. A couple organizations do this really wonderful thing where they send out the job the questions like 2 hours before the interview, and it allows folks to process those questions and come ready and prepared for the interview so that they're able to talk about their skills more powerfully rather than having the focus be on how folks are able to navigate anxiety-inducing situations, and really allows them to show up as they are. So that's a really big one. Another is to ensure that your evaluation metrics support underrepresented folks in high-status leadership roles so that they feel comfortable in those roles and are more likely to succeed. And this, again, is understanding that the work that we do and the DEI work that we're pursuing isn't, we aren't measuring it against the same benchmarks that we did before. We really need to disrupt the status quo and set different benchmarks for folks. The other piece is to embrace open dialogue with employees, and this can be an uncomfortable space, primarily maybe in the beginning, but this is a really great way to listen to your employees, take in the diverse perspectives that they might bring, be open to debate and challenge. There's a ton of stuff that you can learn from your employees that they might be able to share on the direction that your organization needs to be taking, especially as we are inviting a largely multi-generational workforce and a highly diverse team with our initiatives. And then the other piece that Liz mentioned as well is to hire based on cultural contribution and not for cultural fit, because then you might end up leaving a lot of folks out of consideration. And when you do all of these things, you really are protecting yourself against backlash, because you are doing the work and this isn't performative anymore. And then going back to the learning piece, be a part of those uncomfortable conversations. Keep learning. None of us are ever going to be experts in diversity, equity, and inclusion, because even in this role, diversity, equity, and inclusion workshops that we did 5 years ago is no longer relevant. So keeping that in mind and just continuously learning and keeping yourself open to new ideas is really important in protecting your organization from getting canceled on social media or anywhere else.
Thank you so much, Sanjana. Those were some really great points you raised, particularly just that having the discussion is the first step, and being silent on this topic really just, I don't think, is an option. So yeah, but as scary as it might seem, taking that step and doing something is far better than doing nothing. Joanne, if we could turn to you next, I'd be really interested to know from CFA Society Montreal's perspective, did you have any concerns within your organization about adopting the DEI Code? I mean, maybe you were 100% on board, but what concerns did your society discuss and debate, and how did you overcome those concerns?
Well, we are becoming employers. In the midst of this process, CFA Montreal used to outsource its whole operational team, and now we are building our own in-house team. So obviously for the society, one of the concerns is becoming the employer we are wishing to be, really putting forward the right practices and as part of our commitment and role as influencers within the community, the financial community, being representative of the practices that we preach, basically. So there is a pressure there, and I will not I will not lie, there is also a concern, as there is with many employers, as you were mentioning, Sanjana, to do the right thing and to say the right thing and to do it in the right fashion. So going public with where you want to be. But I was able to bring it back to, let's begin by the first step. Let's not try to eat the elephant all at once. Let's just go one bite at a time and move forward. Just keep moving forward. That's what's important in the process. I mean, this is a marathon. We're not going to be DEI savvy and professionals and perfect in 6 months. This is something, it's not only cultural, but it's also ingraining practices and making them so benign once we've really made them part of the day-to-day basis that we do not need to discuss. That's the ultimate goal, but we're not going to be doing that in 5 minutes time. So just breaking it down into smaller increments and taking it one step at a time was the easiest way for my society board to onboard the whole conversation and see where they could say, okay, we're going to be doing it that way. And it really was reassuring to break it down for them.
Thanks, Joanne. That's helpful. Puts it in perspective on how your society started tackling it. Liz, I'd love to go over to you next with a question. I wrote down a question for you, and then I also received a question from someone joining our call about the process for reporting. So I know organizations that are interested in adopting the code might think that the process seems daunting. Would you be able to share with us what the process looks like, specifically the ongoing reporting aspect of it? Then perhaps after this call, we could always share some supplementary information with the attendees if that's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So at its core, the DEI Code calls for signatory organizations to implement and grow the Code's 6 principles. And that commitment is going to require leadership support, not just from HR, but kind of across the business. A thorough review of the code and the implementation guidelines and the accompanying reporting framework should be undertaken by your organization's HR and leadership groups before that commitment is made. Becoming a signatory is in and of itself logistically very simple. There's a 2-page form on our website that asks for 2 points of contact within your organization. It collects some high-level data about your firm, how many people are employed there, total assets under management, that sort of thing. And then that's submitted through just like an online form submission system. And once it's in, you are officially a signatory. But as I think Joanne referenced earlier, it's after signing on that the real work begins to honor that commitment that's been made. As a baseline, signatory organizations must meet the following foundational reporting requirements within 2 years of signing on. And that includes an adopted DEI policy and DEI statement, an established senior leadership ownership and oversight governance process, and an implementation plan to integrate DEI within the organization's people, processes, and policies. Signatories are also asked to report on their DEI metrics and discuss their progress with CFA Institute through a confidential annual progress report. We ask that signatory organizations submit this within the first 12 months of signing on and on an annual schedule from here on out. In the spirit of transparency, CFA Institute is also going to compile that data and report our findings from the signatory organizations out to that network and to the public at large. We need a critical mass of data to be submitted in all of the different size categories so that individual organizations can't be pinpointed in the aggregate data. So it's possible that we'll get data for firms over 1,000 members or something like that before we'll have data on firms from like 250, 500 members or something. But we're committed to sharing what we learn back out to the industry at large so that everyone can kind of share from the best practices and the work that's being done by other signatory organizations.
That's great. I love that, Liz. That'll be really helpful for firms.
I should also add, we're planning a couple roundtables in Canada with the Canadian signatories that we have later this year. So please keep an eye on CFA Institute's website, or you can reach out to the help inbox on our DEI Code page if you'd like to get more information on when those are planned, so that your organization can tune in.
That's great. Thanks, Liz. CFA Winnipeg will make sure to share that once that data is set. Joanne, I'm wondering if I could go back to you and ask if there have been any organizations in Montreal that have adopted the code, and if so, did CFA Society Montreal provide any guidance to them? I'm sure moving forward, as you guys get more and more involved yourselves, you'll probably get more and more involved locally with firms in Montreal, but I'm just wondering what that's looked like so far.
In terms of Montreal, Fiera Capital is one of the society that has signed on as part of the first signatories, but I would say that this is more the doing of CFA Societies Canada, which we partnered up with in bringing all of this to fruition. We do have around the board, I do have a few key employers that are currently assessing becoming signatories, and therefore we are preparing a roundtable for them come fall to do peer-to-peer sharing of their concerns and bringing the discussion at a different level in terms of implementation guidelines and other issues to tackle in this matter. But yes, only one society, but many conversations already having begun with different institutions.
That's great. Good luck with all of it. Sanjana, could we go back to you with a question? What do you see being the driving force behind businesses in Manitoba that are wanting to explore having more structure to their own internal policies and strategies around DEI?
Yeah. For us, what I'm finding is that the business case is very clear, and over again, business leaders are listening to the business case that's coming through in so many reports. There are a few stats that have stuck out to me over the past few months that have come out. One is that more than 3 in 4 employees and job seekers, which is 76% of job seekers, report that a diverse workforce is an important factor when evaluating companies and their job offers. And this is from Glassdoor. And so 1 in 3 employees, which is 32%, would not apply to a job at a company where there's a lack of diversity among its workforce. As of right now, many organizations are facing a talent shortage. They are facing a really big issue with talent recruitment and retention. And so when they are seeing stats like this, about 76% of job seekers evaluating the company for diversity, it underscores that diversity, equity, and inclusion is really, really important if they want to continue to attract top talent to their organization. And then the other data piece that really stood out to me is that women in the workplace are feeling slightly better about their jobs this year than they did last year. And this is through Deloitte. And more than about 5,000 women were surveyed across 10 countries. And half of these 5,000 women said that they plan to leave their current employers within 2 years. And additionally, 10% of this 5,000 were looking for a new job with another organization. This was an increase from 2021. So here you see 2 seemingly contradictory results, with folks experiencing higher levels of job satisfaction, better work-life balance, but they still are looking to leave. And the biggest thing here, the biggest takeaway from this data set, is that organizations that foster a more respectful and inclusive culture are seeing higher levels of employee engagement, productivity, and retention. So the business case is really clear. That's a piece that the Chamber really leads with when talking to our members and our organizations as well. We also did a number of different focus groups before we launched the commitment to opportunity, diversity, and equity for Chamber members. And one theme really came out. So we did focus groups with businesses, organizations, and we also did focus groups with folks who experience systemic discrimination and exclusion, both in the workplace and outside. And one theme that came out of the focus group also was seen in all of these reports that were coming out by Deloitte and RBC and anyone else. And this piece was that millennials and Gen Zers, who are now making up a significant part of the labor pool right now, want to engage with organizations that share an authentic commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we say over and over again that if organizations want to become future-proof, and if they want to continue to engage folks, whether it is as clients, whether it is as customers, suppliers, or employees, they really need to start paying attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it doesn't mean that, like Joanne said, in 6 months they become experts. It just means that they share a commitment and they're being vocal about it. And the reason why we have things like CODE, the CODE Coalition, the CODE by CFA Society, is that it provides organizations who are small, medium-sized organizations as well, an opportunity to showcase their commitment, to show that they are following certain metrics and are able to assess their impact annually and have those available to the public through annual reports. And you can see that in the success that CFA Society has seen in their signatories since launch, as well as the CODE Coalition at the Chamber, that more and more folks are really understanding the need to act now and are doing so.
Thank you, Sanjana. That's really helpful to hear what's happening locally, as well as, clearly some of the data is showing global trends here, which is interesting. We're certainly not alone dealing with this topic here in Canada. Liz, I'm wondering if, I know we only have so many organizations that have signed on to the CFA Institute code so far, but have you heard of any real life situations where adopting the code has helped one of these organizations manage a specific situation? Are there any stories that you could share with us, giving us an example of how this has impacted one of these sort of new adopters?
Sure. So to your point, the code itself is very new, and that initial 12-month period in which signatories have to submit their first progress report hasn't elapsed. So we don't have data from the signatory organizations about ways in which the DEI code might have helped them solve a situation that's come up with the last 3 months. But much of the DEI code, the kind of final version of it, was informed by something called the Experimental Partners Program, which CFA Institute ran between 2019 and 2021. This looked at 41 different firms of varying sizes over the span of 18 months, focusing specifically on DEI efforts ongoing within those organizations. The results of that program are captured in full by a report called Accelerating Change, DEI and Investment Management. But much of what the report looks at is the different ways in which DEI leadership has moved from being kind of like a niche subset of human resources to a priority for business leaders across organizations. It's changed from something that's nice to have to something that organizations need to have, because to Sanjana's point, DEI is seen as increasingly essential to better business outcomes. Of the group of experimental partners who participated in this program, over 90% of their C-suite leadership said that DEI would lead to better business outcomes for their firms. And evidence of that increased business relevance is reflected in particular by a growing focus on DEI metrics. Clients are becoming increasingly likely to ask for DEI data, so firms that can provide it are already at an advantage over their competitors. One of the experimental partners observed during that 18-month period that about 40% of the clients asked for DEI specifics or information related to the firm's internal diversity efforts, and this was up from only about 5% 5 years prior. And we had other experimental partners give similar feedback. We got a couple anecdotes just about how that data can be beneficial to firms through the experimental partners program that I think would be interesting to share with the group here today. And the first is that when you're considering DEI metrics, consistency and patience are really important. So for demographic data on your workforce to be sufficiently robust to use externally, you need about 85% of your employees to participate. But this is private information that you're asking your employees to share with you, their employer. So a good communications plan about what you're going to do with that information, whether it will be private or public, and if public, who it's going to be shared with, is really important to actually motivating people to respond to these questions in the first place. The second point is that you need to give some time for that messaging to sink in. One of our experimental partners noted that in the first year that they requested employees provide kind of like demographic data, they had about 37% of people respond. And then the second year they asked, over 75% of the organization's employees responded. And so that kind of speaks to the importance of messaging around why this data matters to your employee population. Another value of collecting that data is particularly relevant to small firms, which I think kind of operate under the assumption, particularly at the leadership level, that like this is a small firm and everybody knows everybody. So why do I need to collect data on my employees? Like, you know, Liz is not just like Caucasian female, like I know her. So why do I need those data points? But this can be really deceptive if colleagues don't necessarily feel open about sharing all aspects of their identity with their employer. And having the concrete data makes it easier to avoid assigning identities to employees based on like your visual assessment of them, which is actually not a good practice and something that can create distrust within the workplace instead of building the trust and openness that you need to have a real dialogue about DEI issues and progress. And finally, and I think Sanjana talked about this a little bit in her response to the last question too, but sharing your employee data publicly is in and of itself a statement about your firm's priorities. So another firm from our experimental partner program was having trouble recruiting candidates from underrepresented populations, and they made the decision to post their own internal DEI stats on their website along with their job postings. And even though those statistics very clearly outline that this place was below labor pool availability in terms of representation from some of these underrepresented populations, they found that just by having that data out there, they received more applications from these underrepresented groups, because there's this acknowledgement of like, if the firm is tracking this, if they care about it, and if they're open about it, even though there might not be as many underrepresented populations here, this is a workplace that thinks this is important. This is a workplace where I can feel free to be myself, and where, you know, belonging to one or more of these underrepresented groups is going to be seen as a value add, as opposed to something that makes me, you know, different or other from the rest of my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Liz. That's really great that you shared all of that with us. Certainly, I think does speak to an organization's goals, not so much, you know, what they may look like today, but it speaks to their goals and what they want to be moving forward. And that clearly comes across when they make a commitment like this. My next question is a little bit related and is involving the leadership level of an organization. I'm wondering if, Joanne, we could maybe start with you answering this question. At a high level, how would you describe how management in organizations is being run from a leadership level when it comes to implementing their diversity, equity, and inclusion goals? Do you have any recommendations for leaders that would want to get their organization on board?
I think that one of the important elements to keep in mind is that this is not just a process change, it's a people-based change. So we are working towards making sure that individuals feel better about being an employee, being part of your organization, and then in turn can become better ambassadors of your organization. So you have to see it not from an operational pen and paper type of situation. You really need to be wary of how people feel, how people think, and how your organization is ready to face that public scrutiny. It's not just posting or saying that you are DEI inclined. It's really making sure that people feel great about being part of your organization. So starting from that standpoint, and I would say that would speak to reassuring leaders in your organization if they are comforted that this is where the organization stands and this is the perception that employees have, then you feel more comfortable about going public. Often that's the gap between the two is, but what if we're not doing the right thing and we go public, then, egg on our faces. So making sure that you know where your organization stands right now before moving forward is probably a great way to make sure that your leaders feel comfortable with any further steps.
Thank you, Joanne. Sanjana, I'm wondering if I could ask you that same question. How you would recommend leaders to move forward bringing a DEI goal to their organization?
Yeah, I would go back to the business case. It has proven really successful in the way that we approach organizations here in Winnipeg and Manitoba. But the business case is really clear that organizations that embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion truly embrace it and operationalize justice and equity into their workplaces, see better performance, both financial performance, employee engagement, productivity, and resilience. And resilience primarily right now, as we navigate through a global pandemic, is really, really important for an organization. And while I personally am always hesitant about, assigning a dollar value to things like exclusion and discrimination, for a lot of organizations and leaders, when they are making decisions for their organization, that is a priority. And we can't pretend like it isn't. So when you're leading with the business case, it allows for folks to really assess that diversity, equity, and inclusion makes sense for the business. And then when you are a little bit further down the line, you can then approach the conversation about moving beyond the business case of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Right now, the next pandemic that we are facing is mental health and well-being. And that is something that we need to acknowledge within our workplaces and for our employees. And the mental health impacts of exclusion and discrimination are immense. And so as workplaces and as organizational leaders, we have a lot of power to make this a psychologically safe environment for our employees so that they are able to show up fully to contribute to their roles and to their portfolios. So both go hand in hand, and it depends on what you really need to leverage to talk to your leaders about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And to Joanne's point is to just be unafraid of taking a true look at your organization and understanding where you stand in terms of diversity, whose perspectives, strength, identities, and backgrounds are reflected in your workplace. What markets are you accessing or limiting your organization because of this, and how you can truly expand your market reach by improving diversity on your team. What systemic barriers exist in your workplace policies and how they can get addressed to, again, allow your workplace to truly unleash the potential of your employees. And then inclusion, how do folks show up and feel included in their workplace so that folks are supported and they become more loyal to your organization and are retained for longer. So there's a lot of different ways where you can start to talk about the business case as it pertains to your organization and less so in more generic terms. And I think that tends to really hit home with a lot of leaders because it is that personalized approach to the organization. And another big piece I will say is that psychological safety that folks really require when taking on diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Mistakes will happen. People will say the wrong thing. And there just needs to be a culture of safety that folks are able to, maybe stumble through this work, but our mission and our vision are aligned to improving equity and inclusion in the workplace for every person.
Thank you, Sanjana. Those are some great remarks. All really important comments from me. Thank you so much. Liz, if you could address that same question, any final comments from you on sort of what business case you think leaders should make when wanting to get their organizations on board?
Sure. So I think that the business case is particularly interesting in the investment management industry, but that kind of holds true across any field that requires complex analysis or complex decision making as part of the job description, because you're really, by engaging in DEI work, you're challenging your internal biases, you're challenging the way that you think. And that same skill set can just as easily be applied to investment decisions in the same way that it can be applied to decisions around hiring practices or other kind of like people-oriented decisions that your firm is making. And there aren't a lot of avenues to truly test, flex, or strengthen those bias challenging muscles. And this is in my opinion, one of the best ways to do that, because it isn't just an exercise in vain that you're undertaking in kind of like the suspended reality of a hypothetical workshop. This is something that is really difficult because it's something that's been learned not just because of, where you got your training or where you might have gone to university, but something that was to some extent ingrained in your way of processing the world from, the very beginning, from before people can really remember. So it's one of the most deeply held biases that we have, and it creates a change of real magnitude in your firm and in your community as well. And I think the business case in that sense sort of speaks for itself as to broader employee development. There are also, we can always sort of cherry pick some success stories from the feedback of the Experimental Partners Program, and we hope that the reporting that we get from the DEI signatories will kind of be yet another instance of the dollars translating to DEI efforts. But Sanjana is right. There are just really many different instances of research and anecdotes and studies that reaffirm this is not only kind of the right thing to do from an ethical or moral standpoint, but the right thing to do for your organizations from a business standpoint as well.
Thank you, Liz. Liz, if I could turn to a question that I received for you specifically, I think. The question starts, many consulting firms and database administrators are also asking asset management firms for this type of data. Is the CFA Institute working with any of these groups towards standardization?
That's a great question. I'm not aware of any work that we have ongoing, kind of like in partnership with these firms to look at standardizing the different data fields. You'll find recommendations for fields to collect as part of the implementation guidelines for the DEI code. But like all aspects of the code itself, a lot of it is all voluntary. So while these are recommendations for what we think, DEI is also, in some ways, it kind of defies standardization, because while it is a global issue and concern, there are really strongly entrenched regional nuances. And so the strategy that works well for organizations in one area might not necessarily be what makes sense for organizations in another area. And that's true, you know, right down to the types of data that we collect from these firms.
Thanks, Liz. Appreciate that. I've received a couple of questions that are, I think, for Joanne specifically. A couple of questions. I mean, as the code has really been geared towards investment firms to be signatories, some of our societies, such as Montreal, that have become signatories, I think is not sort of the original you know, inside the box for the code to be applied. But obviously, societies are starting to look at ways to make it work for them too. Could you share with us a little bit more about what was involved for your society to become a signatory? Maybe what applied, what didn't apply, if anything, and if you have any recommendations for a society to consider the code, or really, I think, other not-for-profit organizations, whether it's, you know, another board that someone might sit on, investment committees, things of that nature. I think so much of this can be applied to other organizations, not just investment firms.
Well, it was actually key to becoming signatory for us to identify who the code, who would be reporting on in terms of defining, I would say, our sandbox, basically. So this is, given that the code is not designed for societies per se, we established that employees and volunteers, because we have over 100 volunteers working for us on various committees. So we felt that that was an important enough volume for us to consider it sufficient for us to become signatories. Just employees, we would have been 4 individuals. It would have been kind of funny we would have onboarded to the principles, but in terms of reporting, it would have been a little bit more difficult. Taking into consideration or adding on the volunteers made it for us much more pertinent as it becomes reflective of what we are communicating to the community, actually. So this was really, I would say, the key to us making the DEI code part of our reality, was being able to target who we would be taking into consideration when doing the actual reporting.
Thank you. That makes sense. Certainly some societies only have even 1 or 2 employees, but when you start considering all of your stakeholders, board members, volunteers, I mean, that quickly expands. And I think all of the work that you're doing, it makes sense that it would apply to everyone that's really a part of the organization. Thanks very much, Joanne. I'm next gonna ask each of you this question. I'll maybe start with you, Sanjana. What do you see as the most important reason for an organization to not just try and make progress in the area of DEI, but to actually commit to adopting a code?
One thing that I find is accountability provides folks with a structure that a lot of different organizations are signing on. It creates some sort of uniformity and regulation against which organizations are measuring their progress and their success. And because of their annual reports, there is a sense of accountability that the rest of the community are looking to from these organizations. And the other piece with the chamber particularly is that when they do adopt code, there's a lot of guidance that comes with it. After organizations make this commitment to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in their workplace, they receive sustained guidance from the chamber team, who works with a ton of diversity, equity, and inclusion experts to make these tools and templates available to folks. So while they are making progress on diversity, equity, and inclusion, adopting a code, whether it is the chamber's Code Coalition or CFA Society's code, it really provides that structure and allows folks to engage with peers and be among like-minded individuals and make space for peer learning and exchange and do this all together.
Thank you, Sanjana. Liz, would you share a response to that question? Why you believe an organization should consider adopting a code as opposed to trying to make their own progress in this area?
Sure. So I think signing on to CFA Institute's DEI code or any other kind of set of goals, principles, standards that require some sort of like formal commitment does a couple of things. It sparks an internal dialogue around your DEI strategy that might not happen otherwise. This dialogue inherently has to include all different aspects of the business, as opposed to allowing DEI to continue to live in kind of firmly human resources territory. So CFA Institute's code requires and ensures leadership buy-in, and that coincides with greater likelihood of progress on these initiatives. That isn't to say that signing on is the only way to get your leadership team to buy into the importance of DEI efforts, but I think it's important to acknowledge that DEI, maybe more so than other projects or priorities within an organization, is subject to derailment due to organizational change. We're seeing more of that than normal right now. So in some ways, DEI is is in a vulnerable moment as people move from job to job and new opportunities become available. And you know, we had one of the experimental partners from our program drop out because their internal champion for the program left the firm, and no one stepped in to replace her and kind of take up that mantle. So having the organization formally signed on to a code and, you know, committed to the attendant governance and reporting commitments helps ensure that your organization's work in this space won't be neglected and that it will outlast any one individual. And it's critical that the work in DEI be sustained over an extended period of time. You know, we're working to reroute generations of conscious and unconscious exclusivity, and it's not going to be done overnight or even in a year or two. It's a long haul effort, and external accountability, even if it is voluntary, has been shown to be an effective motivator for not just kickstarting these initiatives, but for sustaining them over the course of many years, which is ultimately what we need for this to make an impact.
Thank you, Liz. Appreciate that. Joanne, I'm wondering if you could share your thoughts on what the most important reason would be for an organization that's perhaps already interested in DEI and making progress there. What's the most important reason for them to consider taking that next leap and adopting a code?
I echo what Sanjana and Liz said. It's basically the commitment value of the action of signing on to a code. It really speaks to taking the first step in the journey in a very, I would say, public way, which forces you to be ready to continue walking, basically.
Thank you, Joanne. I just have a couple of more questions, and we're about 10 minutes out from finishing today's discussion. Thank you for those that sent questions in. I think we covered each one. If I managed to read through the chat box correctly. My next question, I'm wondering if Sanjana, we could start with you. Why do you think our communities are better off if organizations adopt a DEI code?
Yeah, one thing is that it provides economic opportunity to folks who have experienced systemic exclusion for far too long. The pay equity gap is very, very real, and it isn't just limited to men and women, but when you start to take an intersectional approach to it, you do see that the pay equity gap is immense among different groups. And so when organizations are diversifying their teams and improving their processes and procedures to account for equity, they are providing economic opportunity that's going to have impact not only for that person and their community, but it will have impacts for generations to come. And then the other piece is that employees' lives don't exist in a vacuum. They don't show up to work uninhibited or impacted by real life occurrences and real issues that are happening. So it can be as simple as acknowledging that major social events are happening, celebrating different days of importance, celebrating Black History Month or upcoming Pride Month, Jewish Heritage Month. These are important ways that we can honor and highlight contributions and voices and perspectives of different community members and they are our employees. And this can have significant impact on the organizational health, employee well-being, but it can also really improve the reach that your organization has. So while you are, of course, having a lot of societal implications because you're contributing to economic reconciliation and economic equity, you're also extending your outreach to different communities and welcoming different communities to engage with your organization. You are promoting a healthier workplace, going back to the piece about psychological safety and mental health and well-being. And then you're also bringing in a lot of diversity and diversity into your teams to have a lot more diverse perspectives represented on your team, so you're able to then shift your organization to better reach a number of different communities. So it really does have like a really, really wide reach when one organization decides to operationalize diversity, equity, and inclusion, not only for one person, but it does have long-lasting impacts on society as large and for generations to come.
Wow, Sanjana, that was a very thorough response and very powerful. Liz, I don't know if you have anything else to add, how you think communities are better off when organizations adopt a DEI code?
No, that was really a fantastic way of capturing so much of the importance of what we hope the DEI code and other DEI related programs will accomplish. And the DEI code really speaks more broadly to CFA, it speaks to CFA Institute's broader mission, which is focused on leading the investment profession globally by promoting the highest standards of ethics, education, and professional excellence for the ultimate benefit of society. And we really believe that a diverse workforce and an inclusive culture is integral to professional excellence, and that society as a whole will benefit from the investment industry becoming more inclusive. A lot of the skills taught by DEI work, not just decision-making skills, but also A lot of skills around communication and acknowledging different perspectives are integral, not just to successfully implementing DEI initiatives in your firm or office, but in just the way we interact with each other as people. Our society is becoming more diverse, and the more equipped we are to have those conversations with other people whose paths cross ours, not just at work, but in the grocery store, or through our children's schools, or through whatever paths we meet people now. It kind of like knits our own community fabric together in a more meaningful way, and I just don't see how that could possibly be a bad thing.
I think I agree with you there, Liz. Joanne, do you have any additional thoughts on this topic of how communities can be impacted in a positive way?
No, I think that Liz and Sanjana did a wonderful job at exposing all the wonderful benefits of going that route.
I think so. I think we've all in this conversation learned that signing on to a DEI code is a starting point, not an ending point. This has been a really amazing discussion. The amount of expertise and passion on this call has been incredible. So thank you for being a part of it. It's been a great experience for me to hear from each of you, Sanjana, Liz, and Joanne. I have many takeaways that I plan to bring back to the organizations that I'm a part of. I will now hand it over to Erica for her closing remarks.
Thank you, Emily. Again, thank you, Liz. Thank you, Sanjana. Thank you, Joanne, for participating in today's event and for sharing your insights and experiences with everyone. And thank you also, Emily, for moderating the panel. So yeah, I really believe that organizations making that commitment and adopting the code plays an important role in making our communities better. I hope everyone here today also have a lot of takeaways that they can apply in their respective organizations. So as a token of gratitude for being here today, Liz, Joanne, and Sanjana, CFA Society Winnipeg will be making a donation to local investment toward employment on your behalf. This is really such an insightful event. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm pretty sure I can say the same thing for everyone who's attending today's event. So again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Emily, and thank you to all our attendees who joined this event. We look forward to seeing you all at our upcoming events, and enjoy the rest of your day.